I'm going to take us back to the question we were at just a little earlier. Jonathan Zittrain, am I saying it right?
Yep.
Is a professor of law and professor of computer science at Harvard. He's founder of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society. What do we do? There's like a catch-22 here. You have a First Amendment defense if the government tries to close you down, but there's no First Amendment rights to the internet platform, which is fundamentally private, because you can't have a First Amendment case against a private company. You're a lawyer. Give us your sense of this.
Let me answer that by taking stock of where we're at so far in the conversation, because Peter said something that I thought was really interesting as he declined ever so politely and diplomatically not to answer your question about what he would do if he were running PayPal. And all this gets back to Clay's point about Lieberman's intellectual honesty. He, in a way, gave you an intellectually honest answer, because the easy answer, especially given how the conversation is shaped up so far, would be like, if I were running PayPal today, I'd tell those feds to, soak their heads. Go drown a cat in the basement. Where did you get that, Clay? Anyway, but he didn't say that. What I heard between the lines of what he said was, so much of our actions are defined by the role that we are in. That we have a role that is distinct. We owe duties to people near us. And he says, I don't want to put too many words in your mouth, but if somebody's running a company, they are under extreme pressure. And it can be awfully hard to second guess them, at least in the say that I would do something different, when they are confronted with, you name it, a Patriot Act Section 215 order that says, not only do you have to do this, but you can't tell anyone that we asked you to do it, and here's our badge. And if you're designing a system from the top, and that used to be what we thought constitutionalists did when they forged a constitution for a state, you want to try to design the system recognizing that people have to play their roles and that there are few outliers among them that will break out of the role and say, I don't care what you say, I'm going to do something else instead. And somehow try to set up the pieces so that the roles are arrayed, so that they are actually in healthy conflict, and that sometimes one side wins, sometimes the other side wins, and the good stuff comes out of this conflict if the pieces are set up right. That's the classic idea of separation of powers. It's also an understanding of the role of the media, which is why I think a lot of people, including in Congress right now, have a hard time thinking of WikiLeaks as media. And if you could flick the switch in their head, this might not be true of Lieberman since he wants to send the New York Times to jail too, but many others would say, I see, if they were media, then I would treat them differently. So a lot has to do with roles. And so far what I've heard from Daniel Ellsberg, this is somebody whose role has been in perceiving a great injustice being done and very little recourse through official channels to leak. And then later to have history's judgment that it turned out that was the right thing to do. And that's how I hear him saying that, somebody like that who not only leaked because he saw the injustice, but then had the President of the United States like engaging in wiretaps and kind of talk about micromanagement of what's going on in the country. Like, of course your view is going to be not only I don't trust government, but the American government has really kind of let me down, might be part, to put it mildly, of his view. And of course, Peter's view as a libertarian, of course, after he's done saying what he's saying, and therefore the government should be smaller. Of course that will be his conclusion. That's his case to argue. So all right, now let me circle around to your question by then taking on a role which is just to sort of prevent too much violent agreement among the panel here, so to play the role a little bit of the law professor. What I didn't hear from Daniel was an assertion that the government is not entitled to keep any secrets. And my guess is he wouldn't say that. What he said was he was against a hypothetical, not yet passed Official State Secrets Act that would immediately and without question criminalize anything leaked that had been marked as classified. But there are some classified things, whether they're nuclear codes or something else, that we would all get together and agree that should stay secret. If that's the case, I think the right question for all of us to ask is, how do we want to set up the pieces on the board, knowing that there's been this huge sea change called the internet, for which it's much easier, and just generally technology, to take a thumb drive or a CD marked Lady Gaga, as was the case, and instead of it being Lady Gaga, it's all the secrets, thousands and thousands of cables, and just put it out there. What do we do about that? And one possibility is to say, as the government trying to be enlightened about it, we can still be against leaks. We can be ready to prosecute certain leakers, maybe even prosecute certain intermediaries. The difference, by the way, might be motive. If your motive is to inform the public, that might be okay. If your motive is to damage the government of the United States and bring it down because you hate it and you are its enemy, that might be a different motive. And in criminal law, motive can matter a lot. That's also, by the way, when you think about the difference between a leaker and a spy, because there's only been a few leakers that have been brought under this title, a leaker is a spy who shares the stuff with everyone. Spies are more selective with whom they share the leaks, right? You're only leaking it to Russia. If you leak it to Russia and everyone else at the same time, you're a leaker, not a spy. But of course, everybody's getting it. But the difference is motive. The spy has a motive only to help Russia. The leaker may have other motives. So I think we have a healthier ecosystem if it's not true that primary parts of it are so controlled by a certain handful of corporate choke points that they are then compelled to play their role. And we should expect at some point, even though part of our role will be to inveigh against them when they do play their role, to try to convince them maybe to be a little more free, we shouldn't have to have a system that depends on that level of response from companies. And you might see it consistent enough from company to company, and I think a libertarian could still accept players who are not governmental but not corporate in the classic sense either, that there's actually a role for .org. I would hope that the media sees its role as not simply corporate, to maximize its profits, and good stories do that. So thinking through ways in which we could set up a system so that people could, in the words of one of my student groups that just presented on this yesterday as part of a class we were doing, leak responsibly, which sounds like sort of a contradiction in terms, especially the likes of Joe Lieberman. But could you leak responsibly? Could you come up with a system that processes it so that we agree that maybe this should come to light, but there should be redactions to protect sources and methods? How can we build a system that will do that? And WikiLeaks itself maybe has slowly been pushed or co-opted into that direction. When they were first founded, the idea was send us the stuff, we'll send it out again. We're basically BitTorrent.
But that's more or less what happened this time. WikiLeaks, as Daniel pointed out, did not dump 250,000 cables.
That's what JZ is saying.
Yeah, but in spite of that, you
Yes.
still have Lieberman staff, and you still have
Yep.
Amazon responding.
Yep.
So the question is, how do you create a structure where there is a public space where a First Amendment right would actually apply on this platform that's privately owned?
Yes. And just to answer your question doctrinally, so I'm not dodging it, that wasn't a comment on you before. Now it was, but it wasn't meant to be. Clay mentioned the Pruneyard case. The antecedent case to that is called Marsh versus Alabama. It's a wonderfully brief, short case from 1943, I think, before they had word processors, so you couldn't copy and paste, really short. And it involved the Gulf Shipbuilding Company, which was a company town. And it was kicking people off the public squares of the company town because it owned the public squares too, and said, look, it's just trespass. And normally the First Amendment would back that up, back the company up and say it's not the government, it's a company. The First Amendment only applies against the government. And in Marsh v. Alabama, the unusual answer from the Supreme Court was at some point it walks and acts enough like a duck, and it's performing enough vital function that's as if it's a state, it stands in the shoes of the state for First Amendment purposes. And the Gulf Shipbuilding Company can't bring a criminal trespass charge, even though the public square is private property, technically, against the Jehovah's Witness who was there. So there might be a remedy, either to say some private companies, in essence, are so much providing the sidewalks here that are normally public squares that a la Marsh v. Alabama, we will treat them that way. Only problem there is Marsh v. Alabama has not been followed since Marsh v. Alabama. Or to try to affirmatively construct the space so that you don't have a company town, so that there are corners where conversation can happen. And then it is the role of Joel Lieberman to try to persuade people and get on his pulpit and say, this would be wrong, please don't do it. But that's not bullying, that's just him as a public official expressing a view at that point.